This is my conversion story, but probably not in the way that you think. This isn't some dramatic story about a mafia boss finding Jesus. It isn't a story about someone whose life got derailed by drugs and alcohol and found God. First glance, it's probably a little bit boring, but because it isn't flashy, I actually think conversions like this are a lot more difficult. What do I mean by that? Stick around and find out. One of the questions I get a lot is, how can we get people more involved in their faith? And I hear this a lot from people that teach religion classes, or they lead Bible studies, or they're involved in some kind of ministry, and they're trying to get people to participate more. And this is a really hard question, because I think we all believe we have faith, but we don't necessarily realize that our faith might not necessarily be alive. Right? We might not really trust in God as much as we think we do. You know, you go to church on Sundays, you check the box, you try to be a nice person, and above all, you try not to sin, right? As if not sinning were the ultimate goal. And I think people that fall into this group, it's hard to get a good response from them because they're not even aware that there's a problem. Now, the second group of people, maybe they're just checked out completely. They go to church maybe a few times a year, and they won't even care enough to respond. So this is by no means a trivial question. But as we know from the Bible and from the history of the past 2,000 years of Christianity, we are not just called to not sin, we're called to go out and build up the kingdom of God. And what does that look like? And so this conversion story that I'm talking about, this isn't my come to Jesus conversion story. This is my conversion of entering deeper into the mystery. And really, this story revolves around my own faith, I think, becoming more alive and letting God work more fully in my own life. So who am I? Well, you probably already know this, but I do video content marketing. I do short films. You may have seen some of these before. But really, I spend most of my time being a husband and dad of 3 kiddos. And in fact, one of them is right here watching me as I'm filming. Thanks, buddy. Thanks for helping. So life is pretty chaotic. It can be a roller coaster. There's a lot of highs, there's a lot of lows. That's family life, right? That's parenthood. And it's a beautiful thing. So I think like a lot of people, I probably just spend a lot of my time being so caught up with balancing work and family that there really isn't much time beyond that. So in terms of like, what else can I possibly do to build God's kingdom? Like, I don't know. I think I'm doing it all. If I do a nice thing every week or two, like honestly, I kind of feel like I'm doing what I can. But where things really started was about a month before Roe v. Wade got overturned. I heard the story of this guy named Kevin. Kevin, if you're watching, I blame you 100% for starting my deeper conversion. Kevin does have a very dramatic story. He was a meth addict for like 20 years, not a great guy. He had his own profound conversion experience, very similar to St. Paul, where he just did a 180 and he completely turned his life around and dedicated his life to following Jesus. And Kevin spends almost every single day on the sidewalks in front of abortion mills trying to help the women and the babies that are going in there. It's all he does. And he's taken a vow of poverty. He completely centers his life around helping other people. And I think what floored me away when I first heard it was the fact that he was a meth addict for so long and he's turned his life around. Like, I didn't even know you could do that. I didn't know that was possible. And the second thing that hit me really hard is Kevin has got this Baby Save book, and it's filled with pictures of just so many babies that have had a chance to live now because of his efforts. And of course, you know, this isn't like everybody. You can't know how many babies you've saved by doing that sort of a thing. But seeing just the size and the amount, it just hit me really hard. And I think it was in that moment that I started to realize, oh my gosh, like there is great evil going on in the world. And if good people fight back, you actually can make a difference. So when I heard this from my friend William, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to go, we got to tell this guy's story. We have to share this with other people. Maybe it would do the same thing for them that it did for me. Now, of course, at this point, I'm still very naive. And there's a difference between hearing a story that impacts you and actually going and spending time with that person. So I'm going to skip over the next bit. There was some struggle involved, but eventually I was able to get out to Colorado where Kevin lives and follow him around for a few weeks. And the intention that I had was to go and tell his story. So, we were filming the whole time. But I think the biggest thing that impacted me, it was walking with him as he lived his life and did everything that he was doing. So I just want to share a few stories of my few weeks with Kevin. Some of the stories that really just stuck out and impacted me. And the first is that I had never actually been out to an abortion mill before. I have driven by, I've seen the church ladies with signs, maybe they're praying, but I never in a million years would have thought to have stopped. And I don't know why that is. I think maybe part of it is that I didn't really think they were making a difference. It didn't look cool. There weren't like a bunch of young people out there. It didn't really seem like they were doing anything. It seemed fruitless in a certain sense. It seemed like they were just wasting their time. Now, obviously, I know that was wrong. If you're one of those church ladies, you are some of the most courageous people I know. So thank you for what you're doing. But when I got to the sidewalk, I was just struck by this overwhelming sense of darkness. And I can only describe this feeling by comparing it to what it felt like when I visited Auschwitz. It's just this immense feeling of darkness in the air, and you know that there's great evil being perpetrated there. And it's so thick you can like almost feel it in the air. So that hit me really hard. But I wasn't surprised by that. That's to be expected. But I think what really surprised me was the amount of light that was also out in front of the sidewalk. And one of the first people I met, her name's Sherry. She's got 7 kids who she homeschools, and she is out there every single day. Right? How someone does that, homeschooling 7 kids, and still gets out there every day, like that, that made me think twice about my own inaction. The next person that stands out his name is Francis. And when Francis was born in Ireland, he was born severely disfigured. So disfigured that his parents gave him up for adoption. He was adopted by an American family who also adopted, I think it was 11 other kids, all with different disabilities. So, just amazing, right? If those people aren't safe, I don't know who is. But the really amazing part is that Francis became a doctor of the same condition that he was born with so that he could help other people. So his name is Dr. Francis J. Smith. He just passed away a year ago, but just an amazing individual with just such a beautiful life. And he also went out to the sidewalks and ministered to the women going in. There's a guy in Boulder, Colorado. His name is Jorge. And he goes out there every single week with his family. He has 13 kids. And they go out there and they hold a sign that says, "We will adopt your child." Can you imagine the amount of love and generosity that was being poured out in such an evil place? Really took me aback. And the next people that I met, their names are Mariah and Chris. Mariah was one of the women that was going in to get an abortion. And one of the questions on my mind on this trip was, what actually causes someone to change their mind? So when I got to interview them and talk to them, what happened was Mariah grew up homeless. She came from a very broken background. Chris's parents fought all the time. I think they ended up getting divorced eventually, but they both cheated on each other multiple times. So he also came from a very broken home. And what happened is they drove in there and they saw Kevin being all goofy and holding out a rose and trying to get their attention. And I don't remember if they took resources or not, but they kept driving, they parked. She went in, Chris stayed in the car, and Kevin continued calling out. And Chris heard that. And I think deep down, Chris knew that God made him for more, right? God made him to be a father, a protector. And so what ended up happening was he left the car, he went into Planned Parenthood, and he found the room Mariah was in and started knocking. And he kept knocking until they opened it up. And when he finally was able to get in, he told her, "I can't let you do this. You need to come with me." So she did. Chris did this, even knowing that he might not be the father of this child. If that isn't an image of St. Joseph, I don't know what is. Encountering one beautiful, grace-filled person after another and seeing what they were able to do. I think what helped for me is that I saw everything as a Christian that I could be doing that I wasn't. So in the past, I was focused on not committing sins. That was, kind of top of my priority. And here I saw these are my sins of omission, right? What is God calling me to do that I haven't? I had this 2-week time period where I was able to see this is the kingdom that God is calling us to build. And I had to ask myself, am I a part of that? These 2 weeks were life changing for me. Probably doesn't do it justice, but I almost didn't go. In fact, there's a lot of reasons for me not to go. And even though I felt like God was calling me to do this, the next little bit, I just want to talk about some of the barriers I faced. And the reason why I do this is because I think a lot of people give up too easily. And just because God is calling you to do something doesn't mean it's a cakewalk. In fact, I think oftentimes if God is calling you to do something, it's probably going to be really, really hard. So initially, when I heard about this idea and the idea for the project formed in my mind, at the same time, providentially, there was someone who approached me and said, "Hey, I want to fund this project." And I was like, "You've got to be kidding me." As a creative, I don't necessarily have people like banging on my door, like trying to offer me money to do something left and right. So to me, this was a big deal. But the condition was that let's find a nonprofit to partner with, so I can donate to nonprofit. They can pay you, and that way I get the tax write off, and you can do what you're going to do. And I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. Famous last words. It turns out that nonprofits are very competitive with each other. And even though you think that you're there to help them and work with them, they can view you as competition even when you're not. So, like, I went to nonprofit after nonprofit and no one was interested in working with us. And, like, I'm not just some like random person off the streets. I have a background in this. I thought this was going to be a really easy sell. And even for like nonprofits that do sidewalk ministry, like nobody even wanted to have anything to do with this. So anyway, funding did not work out. And I had to make a decision. Do I want to do this or not? And, I got to work to pay the bills. If I don't work for a time period like that, we don't have like some huge savings that we can just coast off of. So I ended up not doing it. And over the course of that summer, I just went about my life. And when we started getting into like September, early October, I started feeling this pulling feeling. And the only way I can describe this pulling feeling is the only other time I've encountered it was the day that I met my wife. Um, that's a story in and of itself, but that is the only other time I felt that feeling. So when I felt it again in September, I'm like, oh my gosh, like if I don't go, this is really, really going to bother me. So I called up Kevin and I said, Kevin, I don't have a way of doing this. I have no time. Like I got to pay the bills. I don't have like the equipment to really be able to do what I want to do with this. Um, it seems like this isn't going to work at all, but I just feel like I'm called to do this. And Kevin, in typical Kevin fashion, and if you know Kevin, you'll be able to hear him say this. He said, "Come, God will provide." And of course, I'm like, oh, that's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted a way out of this. I wanted him to give me a reason not to. And he said the opposite. Now I did immediately go, but I did start putting out some feelers. I had no way to get there, but my sister and brother-in-law, they travel all the time. And I just happened to call her up and I'm like, hey, you don't happen to be going out to Colorado anytime soon, do you? And they actually were. They were going toward the end of October. So I asked if I could hitch a ride and they said yes. So the fact that it worked out and the timing was good was just really crazy. Again, this didn't seal the deal for me. So what happened was I walked into church, and as I was walking into church that Sunday, I just was praying that God would tell me what to do very directly. Uh, I'm a very hard-headed person, so if God wants me to do something, I always just tell him, "Hey, you got to let me know." And the homily that Sunday, surprise, surprise, yeah, you probably guessed it, was all about how it's important to be pro-life, and not just be pro-life, but go and do something. If you're going to be pro-life, you have to go and do something. If you believe the magnitude of the situation is as grave as it is, your actions need to line up with your beliefs. And you've got to ask yourself, do you live your life like Jesus rose from the dead and there's an empty tomb? And do you put your faith in God? Or do you live your life like Jesus is still in the tomb? Oh, yeah, it's pretty direct. So at that point, I started making plans and we headed out there. Again, we had no way of doing this. And I forgot to mention, we had recently moved. So by going on this trip, my wife would be left in a house full of boxes alone with two toddlers. I packed up $40,000 worth of equipment in my sister and brother-in-law's vehicle, and I had a ride out there. And besides that, all I had were assurances from Kevin that things would work out. So in back of my head, I'm getting a little bit nervous at this point, but I know I have to do it. And I want to put my trust in God and see what happens. But I was very afraid that I was going to get dropped off with all my equipment on the streets and I was going to have nowhere to go. But on the ride over there, I slowly started getting texts that, people had started donating money. One person donated $100 here, maybe $50 there. Another person donated their bed and breakfast for us to use for a few days. Someone else offered their home for us to stay in for another length of time. And just before we got there, someone offered the use of their vehicle so I would have something to drive around in. And the generosity of everyone who contributed just completely blew me away. And I didn't even know that this was possible. So if it wasn't already clear that God was in control at that point, it gets even better. And I'm not going to go into all the miraculous events that happened, but I will just throw out a few. I mean, the first thing is I feel like people that do the stuff that Kevin does, God's got their back. And I swear, even when he's about to cross the street, the walk sign changes from like red to the little white walk sign. That's how much God takes care of things for Kevin. And it makes sense because he's got the faith of a child. He just trusts so completely in God that God's going to provide. And I think because of that, God shows up. Of course, when we got there, that's when the hard work begins. Because I'm supposed to somehow do this whole big production and I don't have a schedule. I know there's people I want to talk to, but I don't know when exactly that'll work out. I know there's places I want to go to with Kevin. I don't know exactly when the timing is going to work out there. And Kevin, you are a special person. I know you're probably going to watch this at some point, but the beautiful thing about you is how childlike your faith is and that you put your full trust in God. But from a production standpoint, that's like really hard to work with. But somehow, in spite of that, everything came together beautifully. And the only explanation that I can attribute this to is that the Holy Spirit was at work. So I'll just share one quick story of a miraculous thing, even though there's a bunch of them. And when I finally got a day to sit down and interview Kevin, we were at this bed and breakfast. And if you know anything about doing video production or maybe even photography, you know that the light has to be perfect. So a lot of what I do in setting up a set for an interview is I block off all the light. I block all the windows. I make sure they're sealed perfectly. I get the lights in the room dialed in perfectly. And only after that do we do the interview. Well, we got all the lights up and I got to tell you, I impressed even myself with how good everything looked. It just, the light there was just heavenly. And Kevin got to share his story. Kevin shared with me his Baby Safe album. And he actually told me the stories, I think, of most of the babies in that album. And as he closed it and set it down, our light disappeared. Now, my first thought, like I didn't think anything of it. I figured a battery had run out in the lights. I figured something had happened there. So first thing I did was I checked the windows. The windows were still blocked off. I checked all my lights. The lights were actually all still on. And it was at that point that I started getting really confused. So I had no explanation for why this beautiful light had disappeared, but it disappeared the moment he closed the Baby Save album and our interview concluded. So it really seems like the light was this heavenly presence, and I don't know if it was God's presence or angels or some of the unborn children that Kevin has attempted to save. But yeah, it just gave me goosebumps. Of course, there's plenty of other things that happened on the trip, and if I went into every single one of them, this video would be like 10 hours long. Actually, it reminds me a lot of the Bible. What's the verse? Jesus said and did many things that are not included, but these are included so that you may come to believe the truth. Uh, Really reminds me of that, and it really goes to show there is no shortage of miracles being pumped out into the world. And despite all these miraculous things that were happening, um, I'd like to say that my viewpoint like changed right away, and I was filled with all this courage to go out and do both things. But that is far from the truth. So, uh, as we were driving around in Kevin's old Jeep, the back of it is plastered in like pro life bumper stickers, and all my equipment, of course, was packed into the back. And there was a day where we were at the abortion mill in Boulder, Colorado, and afterwards we went and we were sitting at some restaurant talking. And I just remember sitting there with Kevin. And for all those people out there that know Kevin, you know that the conversation always centers around one thing, and that's saving babies. And Kevin isn't afraid. Kevin, talks as loud as he wants. He proclaims the word of God as loud as he wants. Um, and he's sharing stories of all these wonderful martyrs throughout the ages that have done God's will. Um, one of those is like Jim Elliot, who ended up getting like speared to death, or Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who was fed to lions in the Colosseum. And he's telling me what a gift it would be to die in defense of the unborn. What a gift it would be if they firebombed his trailer, or if they filled him with bullets as he was out on the sidewalk, and his blood, would spread across the sidewalk. What a gift it would be if they ripped apart his limbs like they have done to martyrs of the past and sent them to the four corners of the earth. What a gift that would be. And it's very inspiring, except when you're sitting outside of a restaurant just a block away from the abortion mill in a place that is very, very, very pro-abortion. So I'm getting a little bit nervous at this point, and I'm kind of slouching down a little bit. And I'm like, yeah, amen. Amen. I'm with you. But can you talk a little bit quieter? Because I have $40,000 worth of equipment in your Jeep, and your Jeep is plastered in pro-life bumper stickers. So not only was I getting a little bit nervous for my own life, but I just wanted to get out of there with my equipment and have everything in one piece. But he was right, right? He was absolutely right with everything that he said. So in theory, I agreed with everything that he said, but my actions didn't show that. So for me, it was a moment of deep reflection. So of course, I did make it back okay. Everything went well. And some of my big takeaways from this whole experience were, before this, I think how I thought things worked was you pray to God and you ask for very direct signs and miracles, and only then do you step out in faith and try to do God's will. But that isn't how it works. In fact, that's like never how it has worked. You step out in faith knowing God's going to be there with you. Of course, there's a bunch of stories in the Bible about this. In fact, I think most stories probably revolve around some sort of take on this theme. You got Abraham being told by God to go out and that there's a land that is promised for him and his family. You have Noah, who is supposed to build this gigantic ark. And he's told by God there's going to be a flood. You're going to need it. But he's got to do it, right? He's got to trust God that he is going to need it. You've got David versus Goliath. David had no chance in heck of defeating Goliath, but he went anyway, right? Because it was the right thing to do. And God showed up. God is with each and every one of them. And of course, the list of examples goes on. I'm not going to go through all of them, read the Bible. So that was an eye-opening moment for me. The other takeaway I had is that I've heard it said that often in times of conflict or distress, God does more miracles than at other times. So for example, like when the apostles first went out, they did all these signs and wonders. Or during periods of plague or war or some other sort of suffering was going on, more miracles occur. And I often wondered why that was. I think it's curious that during those times are when Christians are more dependent upon God. During those times, we realize that we can't do everything ourselves. And so we leave more up to Him. And He shows up. Anyway, if you're to this point in the video, thanks for watching. I'm glad we know each other just a little bit better. So I just want to leave you with this question for reflection. Do you live like everything depends upon you? Or do you have trust in God knowing that He goes before you?